You have.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you. Take your Bible, turn to Revelation chapter 17. And we had introduced chapters 17, 18, 19 just briefly at the end of class last week. So let's get started now with a little more detailed look at these chapters. In these chapters, as we're introduced to the judgment of the great harlot or the great prostitute and so forth, one of the things we see is that Satan's influence in this world may be pervasive. It may seem like it's everywhere, and it is. But what we have to remember is that it extends only as far as God permits. Satan's power is not comparable to his. Now, he would have us believe that it is. He would have us believe that it exceeds God's power. But the reality is that Satan's power, no matter how impressive, how far-reaching it seems to be, Satan's power only extends as far as God permits. And God permitting that serves his purpose ultimately, not Satan's. It's important that we remember that. So, chapter 17, the imagery you see here, the pictures, the vividness that you see is something that is shocking to John. It's commonly identified by most Bible scholars and commentators. The image here is commonly identified with ancient Rome, pagan imperial Rome. And for the people in John's day, that's a very logical connection. It cannot refer to Jerusalem. It cannot refer to any other city during that time period. Nothing else comes close to matching what's described here. Rome has for centuries been known as what? The eternal city. It was not just the capital of the empire. It was every bit that. But it was also the commercial center of the empire to a large degree. And it was the center of Roman paganism, Rome-based religion. It rivaled Corinth in that period for its immorality, for its licentiousness. Take any distinguishing, defining characteristic of any other city or region in the ancient Roman Empire, and Rome possessed that same characteristic and rivaled wherever else it was found. You want to talk about learning in Athens or Alexandria or even ancient Babylon? Rome, likewise, was an educational center. But what was the education being put forward by Rome or in Rome? It was not knowledge of God so much as it was the idolatry, the paganism, the godless philosophies of Athens, of Babylon, the idolatry and the mysticism of Babylon and Alexandria. All of those things, whatever you found anywhere else in the Roman Empire, you would find in Rome. So chapter 17 highlights that Babylon, Rome here, is the image of all the worst qualities, all the worst vices of every aspect of human life. Not just politics, materialism, not just materialism, sensuality, not just sensuality, idolatry, false religion, deception, empty, or what Paul, writing to the Philippians, calls vain philosophies. That is, man-centered philosophies. Now, the two parts to chapter 17. First is verses 1 through 6, where John describes what he sees. This harlot, or this prostitute, as the English Standard Version calls her. And then in verses 7 through 18, he explains the symbols, the images that identify her. And John is very clear in his identifying here. Now, notice at verse 9, we'll come back and read through this in a moment, or parts of it. But at verse 9, I want to draw your attention to one statement. This calls for a mind with wisdom. John gives a statement here for those of us who are reading this that says, pay attention. Here's a clue. Now, for the first century reader, the people reading in John's time, now you've got a statement here that says, sit up, pay attention. You should be able to see this. This calls for a mind of wisdom. Robert Mounts, in commenting on this, says that the angel who summons John to view this, to see this image, is the one who is later going to show him the bride in chapter 21 and verse 9. And according to Mounts, that makes that contrasts the corruption of the harlot with the purity of the bride. And we'll see as we go along whether or not that pans out. But I want you to notice also, and we talked about this a little bit last time, but notice also that John describes this image. One of the seven angels came, who had the bowls, and said, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and so forth. So there is a distinction here that we need to pick up on. And that distinction is the difference between fornication and adultery. Now, earlier, back in chapter 12, we had reference to those who had been guilty of adultery. They'd been unfaithful to the Lord. Here, the word that's translated harlot or prostitute is the Greek word porne, and it refers to every kind of moral impurity, sexual impurity, whether it's man with woman, man with man, woman with woman, person with animal, what have you. It covers the spectrum, whether you're married or single. It's the generic term. Back in chapter 14, where the fall of Babylon was first announced, what was stated as the reason? Fornication, this general impurity, general immorality. But there's an interesting point in R.C.H. Lenski's notes about this, where he says, this figure, this Babylon the Great, is never described as an adulteress, but always as a fornicator, because she never was and never would be the bride or the wife of the Lamb. She's never been anything but, to put it politely, she's never been anything but a tramp. She's never been anything but unfaithful to her Creator. Everything about this image is shocking to John. Imagine, to try to illustrate this idea, imagine the image of the small town boy or small town girl who goes to the big city, and they've grown up in a small environment, small community. And yes, people in small communities are just as guilty of sin and immorality as big cities and so forth. But in this case, we've got someone who's basically kind of innocent. They've led a sheltered life. They grew up going to church, all the traditional small town virtues or qualities, and they go to the big city. And in the big city, they're aware that people can be mean and unkind and immoral and so forth, but they go to the big city, and right off the bat, someone propositions them just openly right on the street. And they're just bug-eyed, mouth open, wide-eyed, shocked that somebody could be so open about it. Here's John. Here is an apostle of Jesus Christ, a servant of the Lord, and all at once, it seems, in a sense, he is face to face with this image of Babylon, the great harlot. And it's just, it takes his breath away. It's a shocking image, and deliberately so. Everything about her is unclean. Every characteristic, every quality is defiled. There's nothing about her that would make her appealing to a person of righteous mind, and that's John. And so he's shocked by what he sees. And so look at verses 1 through 6, really. The image here, the English Standard Version says, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. John saw, he's wide-eyed, just amazed at what he sees. And the fact that this section, this part of the book is introduced by one of the angels who emptied one of those 7 bowls, that connects this back to chapters 15 and 16 and the emptying of those bowls of wrath. That tells us there's a connection here. Now, talk about the angels for just a minute. We'll come down and we'll see 2 names as we go along, Michael and Gabriel. If you go into the apocryphal books of the Old Testament, a Roman Catholic Bible will contain them. You'll find a book called Tobit, T-O-B-I-T. T-O-B-I-S. Yes, T-O-B-I-T, Tobit. In some translations, you'll find it as Tobias. This is an apocryphal book. It does not belong in the Bible, but the Catholic Church has added it along with several others, totaling 76 instead of 66 in a Catholic Bible. And in that book, you'll find 7 names given to 7 archangels, supposedly, and Michael and Gabriel are among them. I believe West in the textbook also gives the names of these angels as well, makes mention of this. But only Michael and Gabriel are ever mentioned by name in the scriptures. So we have this great judgment. Come and I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute. And that's the word mega prostitute or mega harlot, the Greek word overflowing. It's the idea of excessiveness. And so judgment here is not, is she guilty or not? This is not the fact-finding phase of the trial. This is the sentencing phase. This is the pronouncing or the carrying out of the sentence. She had committed fornication. That's a given. That's an established fact. Verse 2, and go back to chapter 14. We know that's what's going on. And so because of that, this person is guilty, or this image, this character that John sees is guilty. There's no question about that. Now it's a matter of carrying out sentence or passing sentence. Now, go back to chapter 12. She is guilty of fornication. She does not represent those in chapter 12 who are accused of adultery, apostate Christians. This is a reference to those in the world. So she's guilty of fornication in this case. Now, he sees her, she is described as the one sitting on or dwelling on many waters. And that image, there's a connection geographically or topographically between ancient Rome, that would have been the image of John's day and traditionally was, and ancient Babylon. There's a connection in that idea of Babylon. Ancient Babylon was sited, it was built on the Euphrates River in modern day Iraq. It's due south of modern Baghdad. The ruins of Babylon are still there. Saddam Hussein was at one point investing significant money in trying to excavate and restore parts of ancient Babylon. But regardless, the river Euphrates runs right through alongside of ancient Babylon. Not only that, but the Babylonians and ancient peoples before them had dug a canal around part of the city in order to supply water from the river to various areas where it was needed for agriculture and for sanitation, for drinking and so forth. And this is the Kibar Canal of Ezekiel's day. I was down by the river of Kibar, by the waters of Babylon, the waters, plural. Well, you've got the Euphrates River, and you've got the Kibar Canal, or the river Kibar, which is an offshoot or a part of that. And then just to the north, you have the Tigris River, not far away. This is an area, the plains around ancient Babylon were quite fertile. It was an agricultural area. It lay not far from the foothills of the mountains of Media and Persia. So it was an area where there was hilly ground, but it was among the waters. It was a well-watered ancient area, still is for that matter, when it's not in drought. Rome, likewise, Rome, the city, is sited on the Tiber River coming down out of the mountains in Italy. But not just the Tiber, it's at the head of the Tiber Basin, which flows out to Ostia and into the Adriatic Sea. But you also have a number of other rivers and creeks and tributaries that flow down to the Tiber and to the Aniene, which then ultimately comes together with the Tiber at the head of the valley or the delta there. You have a huge number of rivers and streams that flow into the area of Rome. So it truly is a city, despite it being on 7 hills, it's a city that sits on many waters. But expand that thought out farther still. Where is Rome sited in the Italian peninsula? Well, to the west is the Adriatic Sea. But just over the mountains to the east, if you look at the map of Italy, it's a long, narrow country. To the east is the Aegean Sea, and to the south is the Mediterranean. So on a larger scale, it's a city that sits on many waters. But pull back even farther, look into a larger perspective. Now let's talk not about the city, but about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire spans many waters. From the Atlantic coast of Spain and Portugal and parts of North Africa in the west, you have the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Adriatic, the Aegean, you have influence on the Black Sea and the Baltics, you have the influence of Rome going east through ancient Persia all the way to the borders of modern day India and south to Egypt, to the Red Sea, and then down to ancient Babylon, to what we would recognize as the Persian Gulf. But that influence extends even all the way to the Indian Ocean. So you have the empire, in a sense, sitting on many waters. So this imagery that John sees to the first century Christian is going to be unmistakably wrong. And the application is inescapable for these people. Go back to the title of our textbook, Revelation through what? First century glasses. The perspective there is inescapable. Now, the sentence is being passed because of Babylon's sin, Babylon's impurity, Babylon's uncleanness, fornication with the kings of the earth. And this probably goes not so much to fleshly desire, licentiousness, as it does to spiritual fornication. You think about Domitian, who is ruling at the time that the letter is being written, it seems, in the mid-90s, about 95 or 96 AD. Now, Domitian's rule is about to come to a conclusion in 96. He became emperor in 81 AD. He's going to be assassinated in 96. But there are more to come. Well, Domitian passes his orders, his decrees, often signed as Lord God Domitianus, the ruling God, basically, claiming to be God in the flesh, competing with the God of heaven for rulership or sovereignty over his nations and his peoples. You see here the inhabitants drunk with the wine of fornication, drunk with this immorality, and they're unbelievers here. Go back to chapter 13 for just a moment. And in chapter 13, at verse 8, verse 7, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and nation and language, and all who dwell on the earth will worship it. Well, that was that beast back there, taking what belongs to the Lord as his own. They're drunk with unbelief in this case. So this beast is described, this image is the scarlet covered beast back there or scarlet colored, not covered, colored beast is described in chapter 13 as receiving its power from Satan. But it's stained all over with sin. That's the imagery of that scarlet color. Now here, the harlot is riding that beast. If that beast is an image of political Rome, it's supporting worldly Rome. The licentiousness, the worldliness, the materialism, the ungodliness, just the generally impure life is being supported by what? The policy, the practice, the laws of the whole empire. It's enabling excess. So you have here the image of ungodliness, both guiding the direction of the world, you might say, and benefiting from that ungodliness. It's multiplying itself, you might say. Names of blasphemy are written on this mount, on this beast, and that would correspond perhaps with the emperor's ridiculous claims. Now, Domitian is not the first Roman emperor to claim, well, I'm God in the flesh. That goes all the way back to Augustus, to Octavian, who was the heir of Julius Caesar. And of course, Julius Caesar was not officially an emperor in the Roman Empire, but Augustus was. He takes the name Caesar Augustus, the august one, the ruling one, as a tacit statement, you need to worship me. And he's the very first official emperor. Well, others after him, between him and Domitian, you've got Nero and others who want to be worshiped and addressed as Lord Caesar. And of course, in Nero's day and in Domitian's day, the idea that you would address the Christ as Lord Christ, that takes away from their prestige. So we're not going to tolerate that. Well, Jim Shearer, Brother Shearer, in his comments on this passage, just makes the observation, if we see this great harlot as representing Rome, then it falls into three categories or three aspects of ancient Rome. You've got governmental Rome, political Rome, persecuting those who dare to disagree. And then you've got false religion Rome, the idolatry of emperor worship that is both motivating that persecution and being enabled by it or prompted, promoted by it. But then on top of that, you have the moral impurity of Roman society, the lust, the seduction, the worldliness of the capital city that just plays into all of these other aspects. And so Domitian's decrees issued Lord God Domitianus, that just plays into all of this even more. So go down to verse 4, and now she's dressed how? Dressed in purple, dressed in scarlet, gold and jewels and pearls, and she holds a golden cup. Now, go back into the Old Testament and think about this for a moment. Where were golden cups typically found in the Old Testament? In the temple. Now we know that Solomon had them in his palace as well, and probably David and a number of other kings, and that would have been common to pagan kings as well. But in the context of the Old Testament, the serving ware of the temple was purified gold, the cups and the plates and so forth, precious metal, and they were to be purified, they were to be cleansed. But here you have this image of this queen-like picture holding a golden cup, and it's not full of anything good. It's full of abomination and impurity. It's full of perversity. In the place of a scepter, a ruling staff, she's holding something that is an appeal to lust, an appeal to ungodliness. The contents of it, they're poisonous. Go back to Jeremiah 51 and verse 7, and it's like holding out a cup of poison to you. Think of Socrates being forced to drink hemlock back in ancient times. Think about what Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23 as he's pronouncing all of those woes. In verses 25 and 26, he says, look, you cleanse the outside of the cup and the outside of the platter, and you leave the inside filthy. I don't understand folks who, by way of illustration, I don't understand folks who keep a coffee mug on the desk in their office or something, and they just go back to the coffee pot, go back to the coffee pot, go back to the coffee pot day after day after day after day after day, and just pour fresh coffee in that dirty mug. Never wash the mug. I knew a good sister one time who never washed the coffee pot. She had a coffee maker with a glass pot. She never washed the coffee pot. Oh, you've got to season it to get that coffee flavor. No, that's nasty in there. Pour that out, rinse that out, wash that out, and have some good coffee. Well, do what?
Dave, I was going to let you know that you were never in the Navy, because in the Navy, when I was in, the old chief would always do that.
Yeah, the old chiefs in the Navy, and not just in the Navy, but also in the Army, in the Air Force, and so forth. My father was a two-service veteran, and he certainly was. He worked with a lot of guys like that, and I have known more than a few preachers that have that same tendency. And I have coffee mugs in my office, but my coffee mugs get washed after they're used. Anyhow, the image here is of something that's just, think of it this way. If you pour some Coca-Cola into a cup or a mug and let it sit, what happens to it after about a week? Yeah.
Oh, it just turns to syrup and it gets nasty.
It gets kind of syrup, and of course it goes flat, and you don't want to drink it. But if you leave it there a few days, it starts to get fuzzy. You know, coffee will do that too. It will, yeah, if you put it in kind of, but even if it's just straight black, it will start to grow nasty things, and you don't want to drink it then. Not good for you. Here,
that's penicillin.
No, that's not. Penicillin is beneficial. That's not penicillin. That's nasty. Penicillin, by the way, comes from citrus mold, not bread mold or stuff like this. Anyhow, the contents are toxic. Jesus talks about the Pharisees. You make sure the outside is beautiful and you don't do anything about the nasty stuff inside. Well, cleanse the inside and then take care of the outside. She's got a name written on her forehead. And it's interesting, that was not uncommon for prostitutes of that day. They would tattoo probably with henna, much like the Middle Eastern women do on their hands with henna tattoos. They'll wear off. It's not permanent, but it might as well be. They write the name on the forehead. Just it tells you, here's who I am. Here's what I do. In modern day Amsterdam, they have kind of the same thing in their red light district. The women sit in the windows, and this is who I am and what I do. Well, that's the first century equivalent of that. This is also in centuries since then, the tattooing or the branding, sometimes with a hot iron, has also been used as a form of punishment to identify someone who is guilty of immorality, guilty of wanton conduct. And so sometimes it was used that way. But notice the name, mystery. That's a symbol, something to figure out. That's a clue. Pay attention to this, John is saying, or is being told. Babylon represents what? Luxury, indulgence, arrogance. Babylon is what? Babylon is Babylon the Great, not just Babylon, but Babylon the Great. The idea here parallels what John talks about in 1 John 2, 15 through 17. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, vainglory, pride of life, self-indulgence on every level. And she's described also mother of harlots, mother of prostitutes. That's the source of all of this, the high point or the epitome of ungodliness. And notice what else is said about her. On her head is written a name, mystery, Babylon, the great mother of harlots and of earth's abominations, and she's drunk with the blood of the saints, verse 6. That is, she is not just astoundingly vile. She delights in her vileness. She's drunk with the blood of the saints. She has slain many Christians, and not just slain many Christians, she has enjoyed, she has delighted in murdering and slaying those who did not go along with her. And so John sees this, and he's not, his wonder here, his amazement is just horrified, not impressed in any good way. He's certainly not approving. This is a shocking image for him. And so her intoxication is a measure of just how excessively she has stood up or opposed those who stand for righteousness, the saints. And it shows just how high a price sometimes you have to pay to maintain your faith. Go back 25 years, 30 years to the days of Nero, and Christians in Rome were being fed to the lions and thrown to the gladiators, and sometimes impaled and wrapped in wax and set on fire while they're still alive. Just brutality for the sake of brutality, and all because they were Christians. But now continue on. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. I was just shocked, amazed, astonished beyond words, as it were. The angel said to me, verse 7, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So this beast was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss. That statement in verse 8 is one of the hardest passages in the Revelation to interpret for most scholars and commentators. What do you mean? He was and he is not and he is about to come and what are you talking about? Well, go back to the logical understanding of these first century Christian readers. Everything that John has said in context is going to put them in mind of the oppression of Israel in the Old Testament, first by the Assyrians against the 10 tribes, and then by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians against Judah, the faithful, supposedly faithful. And they're going to transfer all of that to Rome. And that's a very rational, logical understanding from their perspective. They would tend to see the Roman rulers, the ones who are exalting themselves as gods in the flesh, people like Nero and Domitian. And you go back and read the history of some of these guys and their excesses. Nero, for instance, Nero's excesses amazed even some of the most jaded people in Rome. He went far beyond where even some of the Sybaritic people of Rome, among the patrician class, the upper class, he went far beyond where some of them were willing to go. It was not uncommon for him to exercise his immorality, his lusts, right there in the sight of his, I won't say his peers, but his companions. There was nothing discreet about him. The irony of that is his own class, the ruling class in Rome, hated and despised him for the most part, but the common people loved him because he played to them. He was a rock star in the minds of the common people because he enabled the bread and circuses and things, and really gave them he gave them spectacle, and a little bit like someone watching a house burn or watching a car crash or something. The common people of Rome, they would not have gone into the arena and done the things that they saw in the Colosseum, but they were willing to watch them. It's like people today with the internet. You can go on the internet and see all kinds of unspeakable immorality or violence or what have you, and you wouldn't ever do those things. But if you're not careful, they become morbidly fascinating to watch. I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. Think about Granny watching TV in the middle of the day. And what's Granny got to see? Oh, you hush, child. I tengo ver mis historias. The abuela, I got to see my stories. I got to see my stories. Well, what are we talking about? Soap opera. What's the whole thing with soap opera? Oh, she's cheating on him with him, and he's cheating on her with her, and this one hates that one, and this one's gossiping, and this one's scheming, and we would never. Oh, I would never do that. But we'll watch it and enjoy the story, and maybe root for the bad boy. Well, that was Nero's appeal to the common people. In Domitian's day, Domitian just took that from Rome and spread it out empire-wide. And so the influence there, the viciousness with which they carried out their depredations, just even hardened people were just kind of bug-eyed and astonished by this. Now, let's talk about this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns and so forth. You go to any church library and start pulling out commentaries on Revelation, and you'll find some, if there are very many of them, who say that, well, this is the rise and fall of these kingdoms since then. And you get into the Protestant era of the 15, 16, 1700s, and nearly every Protestant commentator will say, oh, this is Roman Catholicism and the depredations of Roman Catholicism and so forth. And then you come into the 1900s, early 1900s, or mid 1900s, you'll find some of the commentators saying, oh, this is Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin and all of this. And you also will find those who say, no, we have to go back to the 1st century. And this is all about the Neron Redivivus myth, the rebirth of Nero myth. Go back to chapter 13, verse 3 for just a minute. And there in chapter 13, as we're introduced to this beast that rises out of the sea, what do we see in verse 3? One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but the mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. At the time, after the death of Nero. Now, Nero died about 68 AD, if memory serves me correctly. Nero died by suicide just a couple of miles outside of Rome. He was hated by the ruling class, and they were determined to get rid of him. And he, if memory serves, he actually used one of his servants to commit suicide. Basically, he had him kill him or attempt to, and then finish the job himself, rather than be taken and deposed by the senatorial class. There was a myth among the Roman people, and in Rome particularly, that Nero had not actually died, but been forced to flee, and that he had fled out of Rome, out of the Roman Empire, basically, to the region of Parthia, where he supposedly was raising an army to come back and conquer Rome and become the emperor again. Well, this myth, as time went on, mutated into the idea, well, if he died, he's going to come back from the dead. And this Nero raises again myth, it was a real thing among some of the Romans, and something that the Roman patrician, the ruling class, superstitious, idol-worshiping people, something they feared. Well, along comes Domitian. Domitian he doesn't have Nero's rock star qualities, but boy, he's got all the brutality and all of the ego, and he spreads it far and wide. And there's an idea among some, well, this is if this is not Nero come back from the dead, well, this is in the spirit and power of Nero. And so some of the commentators will look at this beast that was and is not and is to come and say, well, that's that myth that was extant in the Roman Empire at the time, and especially in the city of Rome, in that area. Domitian is the next major persecutor of Christians after Nero. Well, that would be far more understandable and make much more sense to the people that John sent this letter to than this trying to make it apply to successive kingdoms throughout history. People will try, though, to make prophecy always apply in their own lifetimes. If they're going to try to interpret somehow or another, my generation, we've always got to be right at the very center of things, because after all, who in all of history could God care for more than me? That's the human perspective. So he describes this statement and says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. Well, we know that the city of Rome was built over 7 hills, the Capitoline and the Esquiline, and so you can find the names to all of them. But biblically, in the Old Testament, mountain also sometimes represents power or a nation. The mountain of the Lord's house, the power of the people of the Lord's house. You go to verse 10, now we've got 7 mountains that are 7 kings. 7 numerically, normally in apocalyptic literature, represents totality or completeness. But we look here, what have we got? We've got other information. So there's no reason here to read this symbolically, but rather as a normal number, just like the 7 churches of Asia, chapters 2 and 3. So the pronouncement is given in verses 10 and 11. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet, has not yet come. And that whole imagery, that whole timeline that implies is very much debated by theologians, by scholars and commentators and so forth. Who are these 5 and 1 and 1? Well, they could be some combination of Roman emperors. Now, if you want to count emperors, if you start with Julius Caesar, between Julius Caesar and Domitian, there are more than 7 Roman emperors. But you've got several, Galba and Otho and Vitellius, for example, that all of them reign just a few months each, and they're not really scholarly or historically recognized as genuinely legitimate emperors, because they didn't really rule the empire. They were competing amongst themselves, basically, to be the emperor. And this one had his backers, and that one had his backers, and that one had his backers, and nobody coalesced around any of them, and so none of them lasted. But if you want to count those that actually practically ruled, start with Julius Caesar, who's not actually an emperor but a dictator, and then you go from Julius to Augustus to Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. John says, or John is told, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. Now you take Julius Caesar out of that because he wasn't actually an emperor, a Caesar. You discount Galba, Otho, and Vitellius because they followed Nero, but none of them were really considered legitimate emperors. 1 to come who remains only a little while. Well, that could be Nerva, who comes actually between Domitian and Trajan. Domitian reigns for 15 years, almost 16. And Trajan is going to have a fairly lengthy, prosperous, influential reign as well. But in between, there's Nerva, who reigns for something less than 2 years, and then dies of natural causes. And Trajan is his adopted son. Trajan then becomes the next emperor. That poses a little bit of a problem because we're reading 5 have come, 1 is, and one for a little short time is yet to come. And that would seem to pose a little bit of a chronology problem for us, except that if we're talking about Nerva, the one to come, then that makes the one who is Domitian. And that then takes us back to all of the others. Well, West in our textbook on page 117 makes a comment that he thinks perhaps that at the point that John is seeing this, and I had to read this a couple of times to see his point. He thinks that Vespasian may be the one who's actually ruling at this point. He's going back all the way to Julius Caesar and counting from Julius Caesar to Domitian. And if that's the case, then John is seeing this during the reign of Vespasian, perhaps, but not communicating this until the reign of Domitian. That's possible. I don't personally agree with that. That seems to be what West is saying in the textbook. That throws I think that throws an unnecessary kink into our chronology here of when John is on the island of Patmos, when he sees these things and when he writes them, because that puts us, that gives us a 15, 16, 17 year delay if I'm reading what West wrote correctly. But regardless, the point is that what John is being shown and what John is then passing on to the Christians at the end of the first century is imagery and a description that they would recognize, they would identify, and logically they would identify it with the Rome, the government, the religion, false religion, the immorality. They would identify it with all the bad characteristics of Rome that were causing them problems in their own time, and very understandably so. This book, this letter, is meant to give hope and encouragement to those in the face of trouble. And so if it doesn't apply to them, if they can't take it and make sense of it in their own situation, then it has no use to them. And that would take it away from them. Now, some commentators will also look at this image as talking about kingdoms or empires. You go back here and look, you've got the 7 heads, 7 mountains in verse 9. And then we get down here, 10 horns, verse 12, 10 kings, they've not yet received royal power, and so forth. And some will take these and try to identify these as ancient kingdoms, ancient empires represented by their kings. You go back to Daniel chapter 2, and we could see a reasonable identification there. How many kingdoms did Rome conquer over the span of centuries? No wonder that Roman emperors would sometimes describe themselves as King of Kings and Lord of Lords because of all the others that they conquered. However, the problem in that is the temptation that our dispensational friends particularly create in trying to bring all of this into the present time. They try to start with Rome and trace out kingdom or empire or nation after nation across the span of history to get from first century Rome to the 19th century, the 20th century, the 21st century. It becomes a moving target. The longer time lasts, the less sense it makes to try to interpret that way, because there are just too many variables. There are too many kingdoms and empires in between. It doesn't fit. But that doesn't stop our dispensational and millennialist friends from trying to make it fit. Well, in verses 12, 13, 14. We'll talk about these 10 horns, and then we'll take that's 10, not 10, 10 horns, and then we'll take a little break here in just a minute. There's no question here about 10 kings, because the text says that's what this is. Now, the number 10 is normally associated with human or secular completeness, and their authority, the power that they exercise, derives from their association with this beast, with their association with evil, with Rome. They're vassals, they're servants of Rome. They have no real power on their own, and so they receive authority for 1 hour. That's for a fixed time, and not a long time at that. It's a period of time, but that fixed period is a contrast to the power of the Lord. How long does the Lord have power? He reigns how long? Forever and ever and ever. There's no limit to his rulership. The rulership of these images, just little time and then done. Now you go down to verse 13. They are of one mind. They devote, or they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. Their power, their territory, if we're talking about earthly kingdoms under the Roman Empire, they are conquered, and they're subject kings, they're vassals. They have to do whatever Rome tells them to and hand over whatever Rome tells them to hand over. Historically, as the Roman Empire progressed across time, fewer and fewer of the Roman legions were actually composed of Romans. You go from the 1st century, most Roman soldiers in the 1st century were actually Romans, or from the vicinity of Rome. They were from Italy. And yes, they had cavalry that were Nubian tribesmen or what have you. They had various client mercenary groups that would fight with them that they could call on. But the Roman army, the Roman legions, were mostly Romans. Go on down through time, 2nd century, 3rd century, one of the weaknesses as Rome declined was that fewer and fewer actual Romans were the Roman army, and the Roman army was made up of more and more outsiders. They might have Roman citizenship, but they had no emotional, no historic connection to Rome itself and to the land of Rome. And so these client kings, these vassals, they lend their power, they give their power over to Rome, but in doing that, they're actually sowing seeds of Rome's destruction, because their loyalty only goes as far as what they get out of the transaction. Now, they war against the Lamb. They will make war on the Lamb. And there's something that should stand out here. He is more than a match for anybody that wants to fight against him. There's no competition here, and that's a key thought. You look at the Revelation, and what does John show us all through the letter? From the human point of view, from the worldly point of view, it doesn't make sense to be a faithful Christian, does it? Because Christians are not the favored people. Christians are persecuted. Christians are harassed. Christians are ridiculed. Christians are hated. It doesn't make sense. It's dark. You persist in this, you're going to pay a price. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be miserable. Except, who do we worship? We worship the real, exactly, David, the real King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And no matter how dark and grim and filled with despair that Satan can make our existence in this world look, where's our focus? Our focus isn't in this world in the first place. What did Paul write to the Colossian Christians? To fix your affections, set your affections on things that are above and not things that are on the earth. Keep your focus in eternity, not only in the present. Now, as we go along, the servants of the harlot, the servants of the prostitute here, why are they serving here? Because they've been seduced. They've been beguiled. They've been bewitched, as it were. Not literally, but they've bought into this nonsense. On the other hand, you look at the servants of the Lamb, and why do they serve the Lamb? They answer faithfully. They answer his call. Verse 14. Go back to 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 14. They're among those who are called by the gospel. They've answered that call of the Savior, that appeal of the Savior. Okay, this is a good place for us to stop and take a little break. We'll take 10 minutes and then we'll come back and look into the rest of chapter 17 on through 18 and, Lord willing, into 19. So let me stop the recording for a moment. Okay, let's get back to Revelation chapter 17 and talk about the waters that we see at verses 15 through the rest of the chapter. The angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute or the harlot is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. Okay. As we go through this, these verses are going to preview what we'll actually see in chapter 18. You look at chapter 18, verse 1. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a loud voice, or a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. So verses 15 through 18 in chapter 17 are the preview of all of chapter 18. And we have some additional details given here. Go back to chapter 17, verse 1. And the angel says, I'll show you the judgment of the great prostitute seated on many waters, and so forth. John is told here exactly what the waters represent. Now, remember the fundamental principle. When the writer tells us, when the Holy Spirit tells us, this is what this symbol means, that's what it means. And so we don't need to worry about all the many waters and whatnot. We talked about that earlier. You know, you try to identify this as Rome. Okay, we've got the Tiber Basin and all the waters and the Roman Empire and the seas and so forth. Go back to the imagery of Babylon and the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Kibar Canal and so forth. All of that would come into mind at verse 1 for these ancient people. But we get down here to verse 15, and John says, all right, here's what this actually represents. The many waters are people. The 10 horns, many peoples. They hate the harlot. And you look at verses 15 and 16, what are they going to do? The ones that serve her are going to turn against her. Now, John's readers, like we've said all along, would naturally identify this imagery with the various aspects of the Roman Empire and the city of Rome and Roman rulership and so forth. Historically, almost every Caesar, almost every emperor had opponents in the Roman Senate and among the Roman patrician or ruling class. But some of them were much more vitriolic and forceful in their opposition to certain emperors than they were to others. You think about Julius Caesar. Now, Caesar, we've talked about him. He's not a legitimate emperor. He's a dictator. He was a member of the Roman Senate. He was appointed as part of a triumvirate to rule twice, and he parlayed that into de facto dictatorship. Well, when he did that, how did the Senate respond? Ultimately, they got together and assassinated him, including Cassius and his friend Brutus, Caesar's friend, Julius Caesar's friend Brutus. At two, Brute, you're going to stab me too? Yes, he did. So they were opposed oftentimes by the ruling class. Nero was absolutely hated by the ruling class, but he was beloved by the common people. Well, it was the hatred of the ruling class that finally, when he could see the handwriting on the wall, he could see that they were coming for him, led him to flee from Rome proper and commit suicide just outside of Rome. Domitian, in his time in 96 AD, Domitian becomes so full of himself that ultimately he is assassinated to get him out of the way. The vassal kings, the conquered peoples, get down to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. What do they wind up doing? They wind up siding with the Parthians and the Franks and the Germanic tribes that ultimately overthrow Rome. They switch sides to overthrow the harlot. Sin does its job too well. The ones that are co-opted and controlled by Satan end up being the ones who stand in opposition to him, not on behalf of God and righteousness, but simply on behalf of themselves because they've partaken of that same spirit. You see here the internal decay of the empire that was going on even then. But the key thought comes at verse 17. The key thought about this is that it's God who's pulling the strings. It's God who's in control. They don't do this on their own. God uses them for his purpose. Now, none of these are nations or peoples that worship God. None of these are nations or rulers who honor him. They're out for themselves and what's in it for them from their point of view. But go back to Daniel chapter 4, and what does Daniel tell Nebuchadnezzar all those many centuries ago? And by the way, where was Nebuchadnezzar? Where did Nebuchadnezzar rule? He's king of Babylon. So, what was Daniel's message to Nebuchadnezzar? Chapter 4, verse 17, again, verse 25. The lesson you need to learn, O king, God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomsoever he chooses. And Nebuchadnezzar goes out and eats grass for 7 years till he figures that out. Well, this time of persecution is a recognizable thing. You go back to chapter 6, verse 11. This is not to be surprising to the Christians, but God is controlling all of this. God is in charge. So, as powerful as Rome appears to be, as powerful as the government is in persecuting anybody that won't bow down and say, Lord Caesar, as powerful, as influential as Rome is in having this false religion and having it enforced by the political end of the government, as corrupt and corrosive and influential against morality and purity as Roman society is, as much pressure as there is to just go along to get along in the Roman world, God is greater still. You look at verse 18, the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. But what happens to the woman? The King of heaven takes her servants and turns them against her for his purposes. And so we come to the end of chapter 17, and this great city that John has depicted, this shocking image that John has seen, his readers are going to see, well, that's Rome. That clearly that's Rome. It still has tremendous power in the world and awesome influence. It's astoundingly wicked, but God's in charge. Well, let's bring that over to the 21st century for a second. Think about New York City. New York City is one of the largest cities in the world. Now it doesn't come anywhere near Tokyo now. It used to be the largest city in the world. Now it's I forget, number 4 or number 10, something like that. But still a huge city. They've got a crime problem, and every kind of vice and ungodliness that you want is there. Of course, that's true of Atlanta. That's true of Austin. That's true of San Francisco as well. But for all of that, who's in charge? We associate certain places in our world with certain vices. Go to Las Vegas, and what's the nickname for Las Vegas? Sin City. Why? Gambling, alcohol, prostitution, and mob influence. In the old days, now it's even more stuff than that. But Sin City. And it's celebrated by the inhabitants of the city. Well, this great city that John has been shown, this image, Babylon the Great, it still has awesome influence and power in the world. But what Christians need to understand is that power is limited and channeled and ultimately controlled by God. So we get to chapter 18, and I don't know about your Bible. In my Bible, in the English Standard, I don't know if you can see clearly, but chapter 18, which is over here on this page, is paragraphed as the verses. It's like Psalms. It's paragraphed as the verses of a song, or the words of a song. It's not just prose in a block. And that's because what we have here is it's a funeral dirge. It's a lamentation of sorts over what's happening to this perverse city. So this is additional detail. What was chapter 17 about? The harlot is judged. That's chapter 17. In chapter 18 now, here's the sentence passed, basically. We saw the sentence being pronounced, and now this is the details. You get down here to verse 24 in chapter 18, and get my pages to separate here. And in verse 24, at the end of the chapter, in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. Well, that's the explanation of chapter 18, verse 1 to verse 23. Why does all this happen? Because of this. You've got 3 parts. Now, this is not a chronological record in chapter 18. You have 3 sections. Verses 1 through 3 is a declaration. Here's what's going to happen. This is going to be the Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, is going to be laid desolate. And then at verse 4, you have a warning in verse 4, another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues." So the Christians are warned, God's people are warned, don't be part of this. If you're part of this, then you're going to get part of this. If you're part of the sin, you're going to get part of the judgment. So come out. Don't be connected with that. There's the warning at verse 4. And then you pick up at verse 5, and you begin to see the sentence pronounced, the sentence issued from there down to verse 19. And you get to verse 20 then, and from verse 20 to the end of the chapter, you have a celebration of sorts. Those who are saved, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Verse 20. And reading Revelation chapter 18 is it's like reading a melodrama. Now, what's a melodrama? A melodrama is where every emotion, it's a story or an image where every emotion, good or bad, is way overblown, way overplayed. It's just extreme. It's the sarcasm is off the charts, and the hysteria is out of control, and the laughter is wild, and the sobbing and the moaning in the morning is just way out of proportion. That's a melodrama. The description John gives us here is just, it's right there in that character. And that's not out of character for apocalyptic writing. It's emphasizing judgment, catastrophe. You brought this on yourself. And yet people are still mourning for you, for the mourning in you in Rome, in Babylon. And the mourning here is not, oh, what an opportunity we missed to repent and be saved. The mourning that you see here is, oh, no more chance to sin some more. Why does it have to end here? Why can't we just keep going? And that's the imagery here. Now go down to verse 13, and you start at verse 11. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn, since no one buys their cargo: gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, and what? Slaves, human souls. What are they mourning for? They're not mourning that Babylon has fallen. They're mourning, oh, well, with that gone, we don't have anybody to sell this stuff to. And what's their stock include? The souls of men, the lives of individuals. The Roman Empire ran on slavery to a large degree. One of the deficiencies of modern American education is that the image of slavery in our own national history, shameful as it is, and it is, one of the deficiencies of modern American education is that it presents our slave history as if it's the only instance of slavery in all the history of the world, as if slavery was invented in the South. And the fact of the matter is that slavery has been a feature, or I don't mean that in a good way, but it's been a characteristic of human society in literally every part of the world at literally every time in history. Slavery still goes on in the 21st century in parts of South Asia and the Middle East particularly, and to a lesser extent in some parts of East Africa. Where Islam is found, slavery is found in the 21st century. And then to a less obvious degree, let's put it that way, where some varieties of Mormonism are located. You find de facto slavery there, where polygamy is still practiced and so forth. Some of those little communities in the American West. You find it elsewhere in the world also, to a lesser degree. You could even perhaps make the argument to some extent that where you find communism, you find slavery of a sort, although it's not people being bought and sold so much as people being forced against their will to work and live and act in certain ways. But regardless, we come to verse 13, and the mourning in verses 11, 12, and 13 is the merchants who've lost a market. Their mourning is not, oh, it's terrible that such licentiousness and such immorality and such ungodliness and such cruelty. Oh, it's a shame that brought this image down. No, their mourning is, oh man, now we got to go find a new market. So go back to verses 1, 2, and 3, and here's the announcement. I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. Now, his message is going to be unequivocal. It's certain. No question, no doubt about what he has to say. And his authority comes from heaven itself. This does not appear to be one of the 7 angels that we saw in chapter 16 and 17. He says, I saw another angel. So he's not one of the 7, apparently. And his appearance is unusual. His glory lights up the earth, as it were. It brightens the earth. And that's an interesting side effect, you might say. He called out with a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her fornication, or her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication, immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So, fallen, the declaration, she was on high and now she has descended. It's the same imagery that Jeremiah used in Jeremiah 51 and verse 8, where he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem. And Isaiah uses it back in Isaiah chapter 21, talking about Israel, the northern kingdom. The basis of this declaration is there in the Old Testament. And it would have made sense. It would have been significant to the Christians at the end of the first century. Would have made sense for them to see a connection between Damascus and Samaria on the one hand in Isaiah's day, and Jerusalem in the uncleanness and the perversion of Jeremiah's day, and captivity in Assyria and captivity in Babylon. It would make sense for them to connect that and that word, that declaration, with Rome in their day. And notice how John expresses this. Fallen. It's a past tense in the English. It's the Greek aorist tense. Something happened and here's the result. And the result continues on. The absolute certainty here is the emphasis. God has already accomplished this in his mind. Now, at the time that John sees this image, where is he? He's still a prisoner on the island of Patmos. At the time that John writes this down and sends it to the 7 churches, where is he? Well, he seems to be in Ephesus, but he is still a subject of the Roman Empire, isn't he? The Roman Empire and the city of Rome and the false religion and the immorality, all of this, the insane arrogance of the emperor, all of that's all still in existence, still in place, still going on. And to the Christians that are suffering, they don't see any end in this world. It doesn't look like it's getting better. It looks like it's getting worse. Think about what John wrote or what Jesus said to the Christians at Smyrna back there in chapter 2. Some of you are going to have tribulation 10 days. You're going to be in jail. Some of you are going to die. That's all still in their future. But in the mind of God, it's a done deal. Fallen. I've already arranged it. I've already ordained it. It's a done deal. There's no going back. There's no uncertainty at all about this. It's an accomplished fact in the mind of God. And so John expresses this in the Greek aorist tense. God decided it. It's done. This is the result, and it's going to abide. The Rome and the empire, that's going to last another 3 centuries or so. It's not going to be till the 5th century AD, the 400s, before the Roman Empire really starts to unravel. But it's not a point in time that this happens. It's a point in the mind of God. God decided it. It's a done deal. It's certain. No question about it. And he then describes she shall become a dwelling place for demons and unclean spirits and buzzards and things like that. The imagery here is very similar to Old Testament Jewish images of a cemetery, a graveyard. Think about how the Jews viewed a cemetery in Jesus' day. What's a cemetery for? What do you do in a cemetery? Yeah, you bury bodies. You bury people that have died. Well, what did the law tell the Jews about people who died? Yeah, you touch that body, they're unclean, and you touch that body, now you're unclean until you clean up until the evening, until you're purified and get to the evening. You're unclean. You can't go in the temple, you can't go in the tabernacle, you can't, whole bunch of you can'ts associated with that because you're unclean, you're defiled. So a cemetery, keep away from there. That's an unclean place. Go back to, was it Mark chapter 7, I believe, and Jesus goes into the region of the Gadarenes, the Gerasenes, and meets the demon-possessed man. And where has he been living? He's been living in the graveyard. And the people are terrified of him, not just because he's out of his head with the demons, and not just because he's uncommonly strong because of their influence, but he's defiled. They don't want to have anything to do with him. So he's unclean. Well, here, Babylon, Rome, becomes a habitation of unclean things, totally desolate. Now, there are some non-canonical literature, the Sibylline oracles and some other writings that talk about equating ancient Babylon with first century, for them, with modern Rome, first century Rome. And they say this, Babylon is Rome and Rome is Babylon. And the apocryphal writings that show that, the Sibylline oracles and so forth, that tell us, those sources tell us how the Christians would have understood some of these images. That would have been very familiar to them. So the figures in verses 2 and 3, those come out of the Old Testament. Those come out of the various judgments. Think about the things that Ezekiel writes in Ezekiel chapters 25 to 35 about the various foreign nations that on whom God passes judgment. Woe unto this nation, woe unto that nation. I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you. I'm going to wipe you out. I'm going to take you away. You'll not come back. You'll not be restored. That's what that's the quarry that John is mining these stones from, you might say. You can talk about Babylon or Nineveh or Tyre and Sidon, all of these different ones. They're broken. They're totally destroyed. Now, Tyre is broken down by Babylon, and Nineveh was overwhelmed overnight. But all of this, you have an image of God's power taking precedence, God being in control. Now, you also, in all of this, you have a vividly realistic picture of what a secular society is like. Take God, take the biblical concept of right and wrong and morality out of a people, and that's what you have left, is what you see here. And so in verse 3, this Babylon falls because of her fornication, because of her immorality, her relationships where God is nowhere to be found. Now, our neighbors in the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we've mentioned this a time or two in this class already. Every year they'll put up billboards around Christmas time, God is the source of all the problems in the world, that kind of thing. And you have here a picture of what life is like without God in the world. It's no kind of life. There's no hope, no purpose, no benefit, no good. These are people who had accepted idolatry and emperor worship and the corruptions of the law that allowed for it in place of knowledge of God, in place of what they could tell was actually right and wrong. And so what's the outcome? If you don't have a legitimate and a God-based standard of right and wrong, well, then just sell out to the highest bidder. Sell out to whoever will make it worth your while. And that's what's happening to Rome here. So you pick up at verse 4, and like I said, verse 4 is the warning to my people, come out, don't participate in this. Here's why, verse 5, her sins are heaped up high as heaven. God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her. Now, verse 6 is not an instruction to Christians. Verse 6 is not telling Christians, all right, you're the executioner, you pay back those that have mistreated you. No, this is the declaration of God for what's coming. Now, the city of Rome, symbolic of what? The whole ball of wax, the whole Roman Empire, government, religion, immorality, the whole thing, all centralized there in Rome, but it permeates everything that's associated with it. God's people, you need to exit, get out, be separate. Now, does that literally mean get up out of Rome? Well, no, there are souls to be saved, but don't exit this association with this. Don't have any part of this. Don't try to lane split. Don't try to play both ends against the middle. Don't try to hold hands with the world and with God. What did Jesus say in Matthew 6 about that? You cannot serve God and mammon. You try to walk on the top rail of the fence and hold on to God with one hand and hold on to the world with the other hand. It's not that the world is so powerful it'll pull you off. It's that God's not going to hold hands with you in that scenario. And then you've got the world pulling you off. So don't do that, he says. We're commanded to come out, just like 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 17, come out and be separate. And it's an urgent command. It's a demand, as it were, for God's people. You've got an opportunity to disconnect yourself from that. Disconnect yourself from that. Don't associate with the wickedness of Rome. Go back to Ephesians 5, and what does Paul say there in verse 11? Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Does that mean don't you ever, under any circumstances, associate with a sinner in any way? No, because if you did that, the church would soon die out, because we wouldn't be able to speak to lost people to point them toward Jesus so they can be saved. But don't have fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Don't participate with them. Don't commune in their evil with them. You go back to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, Paul is talking about what? He's talking about the ancient Gentile world, and it's ancient from Paul's point of view, way back in the Old Testament day. But you have there a view of everything that was common to the Roman Empire. Corruption of the ancient world's morals in Old Testament days was no different than what was going on all around the Christians in the Roman Empire in the first century. And it's no different than what's going on around us in the world today. But he says their sins have reached unto heaven in verse 5. Well, you go back to Genesis chapter 18 and go to Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, and what do you find there? Their sins reached unto heaven. God is not blind. God is not blind to the sins of the world. God is not blind to my sins and yours either. He pays attention. And so you get down here to verse 6 and pay her back double. Her reward is double. She wanted this, all right. This is her moment of judgment. The attitude and the intent behind the harlot's actions are taken into account. It's not just what did you do, but why did you do it? What was your attitude about it? Go back to chapter 17 and verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. She is delighted in her sin, in her wickedness. She's reveling in it. And so, all right, that's your attitude. Pay back double. You wanted that, you're going to get more than you bargained for. And so you look at verse 7 now in chapter 18. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. It's been about 30 years ago, 25 anyway. And in the stock market area of our economy, there was a relatively young man who made lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money. His name was Michael Milken. And before his fall from power, he was known as the junk bond king. And he made millions and millions and millions of dollars buying and selling companies and bonds and things that really didn't have any very much value, but he would package them together and people would buy them as investments, and it just mounted up until he had hundreds of millions of dollars. And he knew at that point that what he was doing, what he was selling, was fraud. And after he was caught and tried and sentenced, and thousands and thousands of people lost their life savings and so forth because of what he'd done, someone interviewed him and pointed out, Mr. Milken, you knew that this was fraud. You knew that these bonds were worthless. Why did you keep on? It's not like you didn't have enough you had hundreds of millions of dollars. Why did you keep on? He said, well, you get to a point where no amount is enough. Well, that's the image here. Her sins have reached unto heaven. For all the sins that I can indulge in, I want more and more and more. That's the attitude of Rome. That's the attitude of the world. And that's really what we need to see here is it's not just Rome. That's who's persecuting the Christians in John's day. It's not just the Nazis in World War II persecuting anybody that opposed them, or the communist Chinese in the 21st century, or secular American society mocking and persecuting the church or anything like that. It's the worldliness of sin. No amount is ever enough. Sin is progressive. Think about the attitude of someone who begins to play the man who begins to just sneak a peek every now and again at a little risque image. And then he progresses to something a little more explicit. And before you know it, he's got a full-blown problem with pornography. And then what happens there? He begins to desire to go beyond the image. It's progressive. Babylon's deluded idea, it's all about me, it's all about what I want. There's no concept of what's good or beneficial or hurtful or harmful to anybody else. It's just what I want. And that's what we see here. Pay her back. She glorified herself. She lived in luxury. Well, let her have that. In her heart, she says, I sit as a queen. I'm no widow. I'll never see mourning. You want to bet? Yeah, you will. But sin always focuses on self. What's the fundamental lie of every temptation that every person ever encounters? Go back to Genesis chapter 3 in the garden. Satan, in the person of the serpent, speaks to Eve. Has God said, don't eat anything? No, we can eat anything we want except this fruit. Well, why not that? Well, we eat that, we'll die. Oh, you will not surely die. You can have a bite and it won't kill you. The fundamental lie of every temptation is you can get away with it, even if it's just this once. You can get away with it this time. And the fundamental deception of sin is you can escape its effects. And you can't. All sin ultimately is rooted in selfish pride. Go back to Isaiah chapter 64 and verse 6, and Isaiah says, your pride is like filthy rags. And in Luke chapter 17 and verse 10, Jesus says, when you've done everything you ought to do, when you've dotted every I, crossed every T, kept every commandment, what should be your perspective about that? We're unprofitable servants. We've done what was required. That doesn't get you any bragging rights. But the world says, well, I did this. I ought to be patted on the back for that. That's the image here in chapter 18. In one day, all of this, her plagues will come upon her in a single day at verse 8. That is a short time frame, a defined period. God does not delay judgment forever. Now here, that's a short period compared to the Roman Empire's overall length, for example. But the point is that God is not bound by time. One day here corresponds to 1 hour later on in verse 10, verse 17, verse 19. And you look at the mourners that you see then in verses 9 through 19, and who are they? They're worldly people, materialistically focused people, the merchants of the earth, the traders, the ship captains, the folks that benefited, even if it was indirectly, from her sins. John Newton was an English ship captain who wrote the words of one of the greatest hymns that we sing today, Amazing Grace. Well, how did he come to write those words? Because in his life as a ship captain, he had been a trader in human cargo. He was a slaver. He transported slaves from Africa to Central and South America and to North America. But he was converted from that. He was converted to Christendom, I guess Episcopalian or Anglican religion, and underwent a dramatic change of heart. I once was blind, but now I see. I was lost, but now I'm found. The mourning here, though, in these verses, the mourning is not what a sad fate for wickedness. The mourning here is, now we got to go find a new trade route. Now we got to go find somebody else to sell. We're losing on this. Well, you're part of it. And that's what they don't see. But all of these cargoes, minerals and agriculture and livestock, you get down here, like I said, to verse 13, and the souls of men, both slave trade, commerce, as it were, and the souls of men in perverse uses. Now, maybe it's for the gladiator games, maybe it's for a brothel, maybe it's for perversion of some sort. Almost 40 years ago, a college student in Austin, Texas, a young lady named Colleen Reed, drove her little sports car into a car wash, one of those do-it-yourself car washes on West 6th Street in downtown Austin, and was never seen alive again. Her car was found there. She was abducted, it turned out, by a parolee who had previously been under a death sentence. His name was Kenneth Allen McDuff. And he had been convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and then the sentence was commuted to life because the death sentence was outlawed temporarily. And then, even though he had tried to arrange the murder of a judge from in prison, somehow he was granted parole. And while he was on parole, he abducted this young woman, abused, brutalized, and ultimately murdered her. He was found, he was captured after the fact, because at the time he abducted her, he had somebody else with him, another ne'er-do-well, shall we say, a junkie. And when he abducted this young woman, the other guy asked, "What are you going to do with her?" And he said, "I'm going to use her up." And he dropped the other guy off, and then he proceeded to do exactly that. That's the imagery that you see here in verse 13. Slaves, human souls, nothing in the world but cargo as far as these people are concerned. They have no value except for what I want out of them. That's the vicious, vile imagery of Babylon the Great. And so you get down here, the fruit that your soul longed for, verse 14, that's long gone. You've lost any of the delicacies and whatnot that you ever wanted. But you get down here to verses 15 through 19, the mourning of the merchants and so forth. Well, it's just like the mourning back there in verses 9 and 10. It's not sorrow for sin. It's not sorrow for degraded spiritual conditions. It's all self-centered. It's all what they've lost in this world. You look at the change of tenses between verse 2 and verse 10 and verse 16. In verse 2, what's the declaration? Fallen, it's a done deal. At verse 10, in a single hour, your judgment has come. It's present tense, it's arrived. And you get down here to verse 16, alas for the great city that was clothed. So it's already done, and then it's present tense, and then it's an accomplished thing. You see, John is seeing from God's point of view.
The one that you said is real hard to understand.
Yeah, that goes back to verse 8 or verse 9 rather in chapter 17. This calls for a mind with wisdom, and then you deal with this. This is you see from God's perspective, and you understand that it's from God's perspective, and it's not so hard to understand after all. You look at verses 17, 18, 19, in a single hour, all this wealth has come to naught. It's been laid waste. The shipmasters, the seafarers, they all cried out. What was like the great city, and verse 19, they threw dust on there, they mourned, and in a single hour she's been laid waste. Well, it's a done deal for God. He has established that this is what's going to happen. And the focus here is that there's no escape. There's no preventing this. The people who mourn aren't mourning over sin. They're mourning over self. Pause and think. If that's their attitude about this, what does their future look like? Their future is going to look just like this, isn't it? Now, I know our time is up, so let me just touch verse 20 and then the last paragraph. In verse 20, the righteous are commanded, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. You've been vindicated, in other words. To these Christians at the end of the first century in Rome, and it's dark and it's gloomy and it looks hopeless, God has already vindicated you. God has already determined, if you do what Jesus told the Christians at Smyrna, be faithful unto death, you already know what the outcome is. God has vindicated you. You already know that you're okay. You're safe. Not just those that are already in the heavenly realm, already on the other side, as it were, but even those who are still in this world. All of God's faithful can anticipate vindication in righteousness. His judgment here, well, that's his answer to those prayers, those appeals back in chapter 6 and chapter 8, the souls under the altar. How long, O Lord? Wait a little while. It's coming. Well, here it is. And so you look at verses 21 to the end of the chapter. A mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, threw it into the sea, saying, So is an adverb of manner. Just like this will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and be found no more. In the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players, all of this will pass. In other words, this is already accomplished. It's complete. God has taken care of it. All of the things that the stress, the sorrow, the heartache, the misery that accompanies this, God's already ordained that. There's no unwinding that. There's no undoing that. Just like a stone thrown, a big millstone, huge splash, and it disappears from sight. Deliberately thrown out where the water's deep. No more amusement, no more entertainment, no more business. Why? They neglected the one thing that matters most. They neglected righteousness. They scorned righteousness. They mocked righteousness. They hated righteousness. And so God says, all right, here's the end for you. Now, trying to take all of this and make it fit something in the modern world, and trying to take the descriptions, and that's what they are. This is an image, but to try and take that and make this fit an actual physical, national, material, cultural circumstance in the 21st century, say all of that was pointing at this moment in time and these events and these nations, that takes this wildly out of context. Is there an application in all of this for every era, for every generation? Sure. Wherever Satan's influence in the world brings harassment, persecution, opposition to bear against Christians, you've got the same forces that John sees here, and that the Christians of that era would understand to be imperial Rome. The principles apply regardless of the age. even if the images that John sees would be understood as ancient Rome, that they're not limited only to that entity. We're past time. We got started a little bit late, so I didn't mind going over a little bit. I hope you forgive that. Questions or comments before we dismiss? All right. Thank you for being here, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.